Talk, 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 talk. Art of the Zodiac presents Talk, 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 talk. Hello,
Out
Sam
them spot
Reynolds.
out. Hello. How are you?
Good. For those who don't know, because everyone knows you, I'm C. Vivi Henriette, and this is Talk, 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 and I'm talking to you and Gabe Rosas today. But I thought I'd talk to you first, Sam. We'll get it warmed up with you. So, Sam Reynolds, astrologer. I feel like every guest I have, I'm going to ask them to their own introduction because I feel like I can't get the breadth of everything that you are.
Well, I
How do you
can't
talk to
either.
people at parties?
I don't. No, I
Yes,
do.
you do. I've been places. You talk to people at parties.
I was about to. Yeah, I lied. I talk to people, but I don't introduce myself usually because they're at astrology parties or whatever. Um, it's funny that you would mention that. I'm actually reluctant to say I'm an astrologer at parties, but not because I'm ashamed of being an astrologer.
Yeah.
Not at all. I have to warm up to that, but to kind of start off like, oh yeah, I'm an astrologer, because people get weird. They'll go like, oh, you're an astrologer, so I know this Aries and I'm a Libra. Can you tell me? And I'm like, I don't want to talk about you and Libra and Aries. And I just wanted to have my nachos and get to talk, know people. Um, as people, right? Now
Yeah.
you're asking me to work and
Yeah,
and work
I love it.
badly.
Has anyone ever, I don't know why this happens to me, but have you ever told someone you're an astrologer and they shove their palm in your face?
Yes, yes. That was the other thing I was going to say. And they're like, well, that comes from Vedic astrology,
Okay, talk
from
to me.
India, because in India, when I was in India, if I mentioned I'm
Yeah.
a Jyotishi, which means an astrologer,
Yeah.
they would be like, oh yeah, because it's common. There is a way in which in Jyotish, which is the real informal name for Vedic astrology, where it's in tandem, where you learn astrology and then you also learn to read palms. This is
Okay.
not as common in the Western tradition.
Yeah.
So it's understandable, but it's still annoying because I'm like, I don't read palms. Like, and then I'm the kind of asshole would be like, if they did that, I'd be like, stop in the name of love. They're like, wait, what? Because I mean, I enjoyed throwing them off a little bit because I'm just like, okay, you just rudely put your hand in my face as if that is going to mean something, and we haven't even clarified some assumptions here. But I understand where the assumptions are.
Okay, like not you've just explained something to me. Although I feel like most people who are shoving their palms, and I'll say our faces in the United States, I don't know. I feel this still feels aggressive to me. I want to give them a pass.
Well, that's an interesting place to start, and then I should do what I do. I mean, okay, I'm Sam Reynolds. I'm originally, as I was saying to Julia, I'm from Buffalo, New York. I came to astrology as a skeptic. I spent 10 years trying to disprove astrology by studying astrology, which I
Yeah.
thought was a good thing, and ended up an astrologer. So I say that this is my most successful failure, and because I didn't disprove astrology, and not for myself or anyone else.
Yeah.
And so I have been studying for, and practicing now for 20 years, but studying for over 30 years. So I started in 1991,
Wow.
and yeah, it's become a treasure and a pleasure to be an astrologer. So that's kind of some measure of my story. And so I teach. I'm a full time astrologer. I'm blessed to be able to say that and do that. That's the only thing I do. And yeah, but yeah, back to the other thing in terms of, I guess, what we were talking about, parties, or in terms of
We're
people
talking
feeling.
about like parties and what it's like to introduce yourself as an astrologer and people
Yeah.
shoving palms in faces, etc.
Well, oh, and the rudeness. So the rudeness is interesting because you know people often approach astrology singularly from what they know, which is fine because they may not know as much. So for instance, when someone says like, I'm an Aries and, you know, the person I'm interested in is a Libra, I have to explain to them. It becomes a teachable moment. I have to explain to them and say, well, what you just asked me would be the equivalent of like, I'm from Brooklyn and she's from Queens. Are we compatible? And because there's not enough information, you know, it's broad. The only thing you have in common is that you're from New York. But anyone who knows New York, and I'm using the New York example because I'm, you know, I lived in New York for pretty much the New York area 20 years. And Gabe, and that's where I met Gabe. So Aries, Libra, Brooklyn, Queens, it's not enough. And so they're approaching it with that. The other thing is a lot of people, which is not a bad place to start. It is a bad place to finish. I'll get to that in a second. But a lot of people start with self-examination. You know, they want to know about themselves. They center themselves related to the astrology, which is interesting because astrologers have mainly pushed sun signs. And so the sun relates to the idea and the identity of the self. And so people come to astrology with this high priority on themselves and you know, not even, well, somewhat understanding themselves, but how do I fit into this larger schema? You know, and sometimes it feels like gang signs. You're like, Scorpio, ho, Aries, ho. And it's kind of like, well, this is where you want to feel like you belong. And that's cool. But why I said it's a bad place to finish, because then just being consumed with oneself can actually prevent you from really learning astrology. I can unpack that, but I don't know where we are in terms of.
No, I actually want you to unpack that. I want you to unpack that and then we'll bring Gabe on to continue this conversation. I want to drop something. So we both know Larry Arrington, who's like my mentor, your friend. Like, I love Larry Arrington so much.
She wrote me after you, I guess, had talked to me. So,
good.
Hi, Larry, if you're watching.
Mutual adoration for both of you. And something we talk about a lot, the two of us, is that you're going to fill me on and correct timeline here. But the fact that, like, you know, mundane astrology existed way longer than birth chart astrology, right? Like there was a concept of like a collective before we kind of eventually narrowed it all the way down to like the sun sign. And so this idea of, go on.
No, I interrupted you.
Just this idea of like sun sign astrology feels like it's a very narrow entrance, right? It's like, I am this, we've kind of like, it feels like a comment on the sort of maybe capitalist culture we live in, right? Like we're all running around as like these little identities, where I think there's a beauty about astrology that it really shows where we are like sort of woven into the greater story with each other.
Yes, but I think it predates capitalism, and I don't think capitalism, you know, related to what we're talking about, individualism, is the most awful thing. So let me explain.
Please.
So in terms of mundane astrology and its history, it probably applied more to monarchies and to, you know, certain classes of people. It wasn't for everyone. And that's probably more embedded in its history, starting from, you know, Babylon or what we would say in terms of Sumeria, and then onward. And then it came into people. And why I think it's what has developed this idea of focus or attention to the individual is important, because the individual is probably a newer thought and a newer set of thoughts in our history than almost anything else. And I think it's important. Like, well, why is it important? Well, it's important, and I think we should come to a balance, you know, between the idea of the collective and cycles related to the collective and the individual. Because if anyone who's kind of grown up in a very traditional culture, you are loaded with expectations, and you're like some prospect of your individual sense of direction and self are spoken for before you can speak for yourself. And that was kind of the idea, you know. I'll give you a weird example. So it took a long time for hotels to take root in Africa, in the continent, in the deeper, and especially sub-Saharan Africa. And the reason why was it was more of a foreign concept to go someplace where you didn't have people, family, some sense of connection. So the idea that you as an individual would go someplace where you didn't have family connection was kind of like mind blowing. Like, why would you do
Wow.
that? Like, where are you going?
Yeah.
Like, why would you do that? Or if you like, even as it was explained to me from one of my African professors when I was studying African American studies at Temple University in Philadelphia, they, if you went off by yourself, like, why are you off by yourself? What are you doing? I'm thinking, why? What do you? So this idea of having singular space away from the collective, and I'm just using Africa as an example. I don't think that was exclusive to Africa. I think that was most of the pre-modern world. That's why I said predates capitalism.
Yeah.
So, it was kind of this thing like, what are you doing? So I think the individual is actually a good thing because it's helped accelerate particular developments in our society. And, like I can be my own astrologer rather than feel like, no, your father was a woodmaker. You're going to be a woodmaker. That's your life. So what are you doing? So I think that does become an important development for self-actualization of the person.
And I like that. Like, I feel like coming back to this beginning. Actually, I'm like pausing to get too deep in this conversation because I want to bring Gabe onto this. Maybe this is a good sort of quote commercial break before I ask you more questions on this conversation. So the whole point of this talk today was I wanted to bring you and Gabriel or Gabe Rosas on to talk about each other or talk with each other and me. It's a conversation.
I'm glad you made the correction. Like, oh, yo, I can talk about him like a dog. Let's do it. Yeah, that's great.
Well, okay. Well, that's like this is sort of the pivot point. I would like you, and I know I'm putting you on the spot here. Would you mind doing the introductions for Gabe?
Okay, sure.
How would you describe Gabe to people? We're about to bring him on. Who is Gabe?
I
How
mean,
do you know him?
I often say, Gabe, okay, we met on Twitter. And Gabe, at one point, rarely talked about astrology in public, right? He followed me. He liked my tweets. But he didn't really volunteer a lot of information about astrology.
Okay.
Then I remember, and this is, oh boy, I want to say at least now 12 years ago. So one day I tweeted something, and then he said very small thing, which led me to believe correctly he knew a lot more about astrology. So I privately started talking with him. I was like, and he knew so much, especially about Hellenistic astrology, which at the time, 12 years ago, was not popular at all.
Yeah.
And so I met with him for the first time downtown in New York.
Okay.
And he blew me away in terms of the scope and breadth of information that he has with astrology. So I often say about Gabe, he's one of the most knowledgeable young people I know about astrology. And I say young, meaning like under 60, right? Compared to like Rob Hand. There's a lot of older astrologers who, I mean, like Rob Hand and other people who I think are very knowledgeable. But just his ability to be able to be discursive with Hellenistic astrology, traditional astrology, I should say medieval astrology, Islamic astrology, and modern astrology is to be well lauded. And I'm glad to see that he's getting out there more because he's a treasure. And when people have met him and talked to him, they discover how much of a treasure is. And most people love that Gabe likes their tweets because he supports nearly everybody. You don't want to be on Gabe's bad side. I've only seen that really once, and it's not pretty. No. But he's mostly on everyone's good side.
Yeah, it's Gabe's like such a like lovely breath of fish. I have Gabe. I'll gush a little, and then I'll bring him on to single-handedly thank for a few friendships I have. Because, I considered Gabe a dear friend, and Gabe has a lot of other really dear friends. And it's the kind of person where you can say to somebody, oh, like we have Gabe in common. And suddenly it's like, that's like enough to like ingratiate you to someone because he's that quality of a character.
Yep.
So
That's exactly right.
So everyone, you're in for a real treat. If you have no idea who we're talking about, you may or may not. You're about to. So I wish I had like a drum roll. I wish I had a band. I wish I had a couch. By the way, we're talking, just going to drop about Dick Cavett, which maybe we'll bring up at some point in this conversation.
All
Here we
right,
go.
let's do it.
Ah!
There he is. Wearing yellow.
Yeah, I decided to wear yellow today.
What's going on? And happy birthday, Wanda. I'm looking at the comments now. I can see them.
Aw.
So that's cool. So, Gabe, we were just dogging your name.
Oh, there we are. All right.
Yeah, so there you go.
Yeah, I heard people talking mad shit about me.
The worst.
The worst.
The worst.
It's always saying thank you for the kind words.
You're sure, buddy? You
So-
oh wait, you could hear? Damn it.
I want to talk a little bit about, I actually didn't get into your biography, but yours is so rich, Sam. I mean, they're both so rich because we could spend an hour on each of you. But I do want to talk a little bit about your background, Gabe, before I bring the conversation like full circle. And I know we've talked about this before, but how did you get into astrology?
Well, really, there were two sort of motivations. One was someone at work. I was at the beginning of my career in data analytics, and at this particular job, there was an individual who I saw using astrology. They were using it to play the stock market, and I was very, similar attitude to Samuel. Was like, what are you doing with this bullshit? This is nonsense. And the guy's like, you don't know what you're talking about. You don't have any basis to say anything. What? that this person would just dismiss me, which honestly I think is probably the better attitude. It's just like, oh yeah, nah, fuck you, get out of here. Better way to approach skepticism than anything else. But then he's like, okay, read this book, and it was Horoscope Symbols by Rob Hand.
Yeah.
And I read that, and I was like, oh, this actually is some sort of logical. There's something to this that it makes sense. It's not just nonsense. It's okay. That started. Didn't turn me into someone who wanted to pursue astrology. It was more like someone who developed actual respect for the subject.
Mm-hmm.
But not that long after, I wanted to basically at that point in my life, I was like, I need to understand medieval magic. I was already doing stuff of my own in a more modern milieu, and I was like, I need to know how. Agrippa doesn't make any damn sense to me. I need to figure out why. And he's always talking about astrology, and also you don't even know it. You can't even do any of this, and it's like, I don't know what this is about. So, but I definitely felt that the astrology stuff that I had seen in bookstores or whatever was not that kind of astrology. It was more a psychological or sort of new age spirituality astrology. There wasn't the astrology that actually makes sense for something like Agrippa. So I was like, where do I get that? How do I find that? And so I'm like online at work, looking at the internet, trying to find anything about earlier astrology, medieval astrology, whatever.
And this, for reference, this is what, the early 2000s, so or late 90s?
This is like 99.
Okay, early internet. Okay, go on.
Yeah, early internet. And I stumbled upon 2 websites. Well, 3 actually. Well, I don't know. Was Skyscript there yet? Maybe. Or was that a little later? But Project Hindsight.
Okay.
And Robert Zoller. At this point, this was the New Library era of Robert Zoller. And from perusing that, it was like, okay, this is what I'm looking for. And it really was more Robert Zoller at the time. So I went and did the New Library course, and that's really how I became an astrologer. So I wanted to understand this other stuff, and I needed the astrology.
And you're kind of like, I think that and Gabe, you can sorry, Sam, feel free to unmute yourself. You can start to integrate the conversation, all of us. you know, something's really fascinating about you is you were at early Project Hindsight stuff, right? That's
Well, yeah,
a big part of your
not early. I mean, I think I probably came in towards the later end, really. But Project Hindsight was always like a thing in the back of my mind. So I'd heard about it. I was like, oh, it's all Greek stuff, but it's like I'm doing this thing right now. One day I'll get to that. They eventually came. And then like that's around like 2008. 2008 was when I first went there. So,
and so okay, go on.
Yeah, so that's that part of what I was doing. But there were so many other people who had been there much longer than I had. Actually, was at a talk the other night, a Zoom thing. They had Bill Johnson on, who was one of the OG guys, and he was doing a talk for Astrology Society of Kentucky. So I don't know if they're going to put that out or not, but he was on that. He talked for a good long while about the olden days and all that stuff from the early 90s stuff.
Wow.
And my connection to Project Hindsight was secondhand through horoscopic astrology on MySpace. So
Wow.
some of the folks who were at Project Hindsight were on there, especially, well, now Chris Brennan, who started horoscopic astrology, and then Spearbearer, who's Alan White.
Wow. So did you two, I'm curious, because you just met, I mean, 12 years ago is a long time, but you were both sort of in the astro world at the same time. Did you ever like reference, did you two ever sort of, did your cross paths before this Twitter moment?
No,
we never knew anything about
not consciously. I'm not aware of, Gabe beforehand.
No, the first time I ever saw anything from Samuel that I knew of Samuel's existence was Twitter. So I'm assuming it's likewise with Samuel.
Yeah, it was the
for
same.
me.
And like I said, Gabe didn't tweet much astrology at the time.
No.
So you wouldn't have known he was an astrologer or into astrology until something got retweeted or something what else, and you like, wait, oh, okay. And then he just laid it down.
Yeah.
Do you remember go on?
I've only recently been more public facing about that sort of thing. Only in the last couple of years. And it's I guess I have the attitude of like, don't talk about stuff. This is not stuff to be talked about in a casual sort of manner with just anybody.
That's true.
Yeah. So I and also the idea was like I don't need people having assumptions about me. About knowing exactly how weird I am. So I don't need them. I don't need to add more to that. So I like maintain, operational discipline in terms of like what I say to who about what.
One of the questions I asked Sam was like, how do you introduce yourself at parties? Like, do you tell people you're an astrologer? And how does that feel? I need you.
No. Nobody needs to know once it comes out in some other way. I don't need to advertise that at all.
but still, how do you? Now I'm curious. How do you introduce yourself at parties?
I just introduce myself as Gabe.
Right.
Talking about your work, like the usual conversation that people have, like, oh, what do you do for a living? I could not care less about what people do for a living, unless it's something they like really care about, like it's a passionate thing for them. I don't want to know.
Although that seems like a very New York thing, by the way. I mean, I
Yeah.
don't think that's always true other parts of the country, as I'm learning now, living somewhere else. But New York is kind of like, well, what do you do? Which, if you know New York culture, it's a sidebar to like, how can you help me? Right?
Yeah.
How are you useful?
It's fishing product.
Right. So you think about it. It depends on where I am, but most often at parties, I'll just say, yeah, I'm Sam. I do consulting, or I'll say I'm a writer. All these things are true because I have been a writer and I was doing more writing, but I don't get into it. But when I was a bit younger and still newer into astrology, I would say whack things. Anyway, I would say I'm Gary Coleman's wine taster. I would. Yeah, I would just whatever. Until he died, and then I was like, okay, I can't say that anymore.
He used to be Gary Coleman's wine taster.
Oh yeah, right. I should say that. I used to be Gary Coleman's wine taster. Whose wine taster are you now? Matthew McConaughey. I don't know. I just made that up. I should probably use that.
That's the new one,
right? I don't even drink.
People believe that,
right? I don't even drink, so I spit it right out.
Do you remember when you first met in New York, the conversation you two had? Like, where there's, I feel like you two are really good friends. Like, do you remember that first interaction?
Well, yeah, because I think this is right, Gabe. We didn't meet long. Well, was it when I was taking the ESAR 6-hour exam? No, it was before that, I think. But it was definitely downtown in that plaza place, right? That we met.
I'm trying to remember if did I meet you at
Financial District
teaching? Teaching something? Is that the first time I went to see you? Or because I remember we met at a bar.
Oh wow. I thought it was the financial district.
Which district? Financial district. Yeah, the bar in the financial district.
But it wasn't a bar. It was a wide open space where we found a table. And I remember like these fake palms or whatever.
I could have sworn it was a bar, but maybe.
Okay, that's interesting.
Too many bars.
So we're having some problem figuring that out. Like our first meeting, what that was like. I think it was definitely convivial.
Yeah.
And just talking about astrology, and that's, basically what he had studied. Like we both had Zoller in common and New Library. Then we talked about that because what's interesting about New Library, and we won't get too deep into this, but they were hustling Rob Zoller. Yeah. The people who you started that for Rob ended up robbing him, actually.
Yeah.
Nope. So I think we talked about that. Yeah. And then maybe some characters on Twitter. So
yeah, there's some weirdos on Twitter as there always have been.
Yeah, and Twitter was a fascinating at that time avenue for me. I met someone who became my best friend. I met Gabe, and I met my wife on Twitter. So
wow. I think this is a question I was going to ask somewhere in the middle of this conversation, but I think like when you start to enter astrology world, it's very like, I went out I'll just give you this story, right? I went out the other day, which is something I don't do that often. Like I feel like I spend a lot of time I leave my house. I'm not a shut-in. But like I went out, it's something that wasn't curated. It wasn't a conference. It wasn't a retreat. It wasn't like meeting up with an astrologer. I just like went out and I was like appalled. I was like, I can't, like this world feels so uncurated. And I realized the sort of richness that astrology has given my life, that I can like go home and like chat on like Instagram or Threads or whatever, or like, like I have this whole life just filled with astrology people that sort of happened in the last like 2 years. And it's like really beautiful. And this is something that you two have been immersed for years and years and years, right? Decades plus. Do you consider like, Astro World kind of like a family, or like, what do you think about the social dynamics around this stuff, having met on Twitter?
I definitely think of it more as a family of misfits, where we come together and feel some camaraderie. At our best, it is beautiful to be around people who speak your language, and feel a sense of connection. At its worst, you may come across people whose egos, including your own, becomes too heightened and too invested, where you can't appreciate someone else's opinion or they can't appreciate yours on a certain take. So there are definitely some schisms that happen within the community.
Yeah.
But for the most part, you know, it is where you feel some familiarity.
Gabe.
Gabe?
Yeah, I mean, at its best, it is like family, right? It just isn't always at its best, unfortunately. A lot of it is like it can just be like a really loud cacophony of people shouting at each other.
And it's gotten louder. So when
Yeah.
Gabe and I first got on,
Yeah.
there was no Astro Twitter as we commonly talk about it.
Yeah.
There was Black Twitter, for instance,
Okay.
and there were astrologers on Twitter. But you know, these were generally people who had been studying for a number of years, who found Twitter. And Twitter was kind of more at one time, it's the cutting edge, and it was kind of a welcome relief from the largesse that we call Facebook.
Yeah.
And so when Gabe and I were on, there were people like now who, you know, we see Janelle, Mecca Woods, also Sagittarian Mind, you know, even a good number of people of color. There weren't a lot of white astrologers on Twitter that I knew of. So there was more of a sense of, you know, community, connection, and really trying to support each other.
Yeah.
I think that's changed in tone.
Yeah, it's become a thing where, I mean, I've made this analogy before that it's become like a fandom. For the most part, a lot of people who are on Astro Twitter are fans of astrology, may not know too much about it, or don't, even if they think they do sometimes, unfortunately. And it becomes like, yeah, it becomes like this fanish thing. People like certain kinds of astrology as opposed to others. It gets sort of mixed up in like that version of stan culture online where people really like the thing they like and they must hate all the things that are not like the thing they like.
Absolutely.
And so that becomes part of the thing. Also, people looking to establish some sort of authority through social media, because that's the way social media works. It's like people have to like shout and get noticed, and then you have the hot takes, and you have all that sort of sophistical apparatus on social media where people go and gin up controversy to get attention, and hopefully that attention leads to something, or maybe it is only simply for the attention. But yeah, it becomes there's a toxicity that's sort of entered in with the much larger crowd, and then all the benefits of having a larger crowd as well. But that sort of has ramped up a lot, and particularly with places like Twitter in its sort of death spiral at the moment. You know, it's like I don't know if it's getting worse or people are just jumping ship, and it hasn't been as annoying because there's not that many people.
And yeah, and I'm really concerned about that in the sense that, you know, we had for a time a cohesive place where people could talk and connect about astrology. And I think even, you know, I think the apex was probably during the pandemic 2020, or the start of the pandemic, where, you know, that was the place to be to communicate about astrology. And I think we could say Astro Twitter came more into its own, and then it started to fall off subsequently from there. And my concern about that is now there's this splintering of all these diverse voices that are marginalized, whether we're talking about disability Twitter, Black Twitter, Astro Twitter, all these different communities that existed. Now people are, you know, some people are Blue Sky, some people went to Mastodon, some are on Threads, some went to Spill. There's some other people you may not even know about some of these other communities. And so we may not have that glorious cohesion. You know, it's like the breakup of the Roman Empire. So,
you know, can I I'm going to build off that and ask a question for both of you. It's a big question. You know, going back to the sort of our earlier conversation that we started with, Sam, around like astrology in the individual, right, and the role of sun sign astrology. For each of you to answer this, what do you think, or how do you consider the role of the astrologer in contemporary times? Like, as astrologers, what do you think your role in society is?
I mean, what ideally what it could be or what it is, because what it is for a lot of people,
Both.
it's an entertainment. And so
It's
I'm
what?
like, for a lot of people, it's an entertainment, really.
Okay.
So we are sort of in that kind of space, even though we probably don't want to be. We probably want to be people who provide guidance and support, and not therapy, but like to be in that sort of counseling space where we're there to help people deal with their lives, improve upon their lives, these sorts of things, right? But it's also, I think, in the public eye, it's a sort of amusement. So we're sort of in this weird space where I think we do try to overcompensate and try to take ourselves extremely seriously. I know I've been guilty of it. I'm sure other people have as well. Because I do take it seriously. I think it's an important thing. I think this is a thing. This is a subject. Astrology is a subject that has been the province of the greatest minds of human history. And now it's like, you know, the thing that they throw in between sports and weather. You know, on the news, on like, you know, the Spanish channel news, and they'll bring out some astrologer who's like very flamboyant in some fashion, and they're like, okay, they'll talk about, you know, Sagittario for like 10 minutes, and then they'll move on to like weather. And so it's like, yeah. So it's interesting situation, right? Interesting position to be in.
Yeah, I mostly agree with that. I think that it has become this kind of entertainment, but along the spectrum of like news. You know, one of the things I've been talking about lately is that astrologers have really gotten into becoming Astro CNN, where we want to talk about everything. Everyone's looking for a headline and a take on something, and everything becomes a headline. You know, like, you know, the planet Makemake has entered Sagittarius. I mean, I'm making that up. I don't know where Makemake is. And then it becomes this whole thing, which is not to say it's not important, but everything seems important. And then it becomes a question of like, how do you position things if everything is of the same valence? And I think also one dangerous thing that I see happening related to public use of astrology, I think, is kind of telling people what to think and then using the authority of the stars is like, this is true then. Like, because I, you know, without any kind of accountability, which probably was more in astrology's history, a little more.
Yeah.
Like there were real consequences, but less so now. What do you mean? Like, so for instance,
yeah,
William Lilly almost lost his life for having talked about the Great Fire of London, right? Now, I'm not encouraging anyone to say like, well, let's hold astrologers accountable by like capital punishment if they fuck up or get it wrong. No, I'm not encouraging that. But at the same time, like, you know, you said such and such happened. Did you cause it? Like, what happened? Or, you know, astrologers also predicted a little earlier than that this great flood when they're like, well, a whole flood of planets in Pisces. And it didn't happen. There was no great flood. So now we have astrologers who kind of saying all kinds of things. But I'm like, is that true? Is that going to happen? You know, and we're not being fair, even with each other. So, for instance, there was one astrologer, and Gabe knows who I'm talking about, who took to task a bunch of astrologers for predicting that Hillary Clinton would win in 2016. Obviously, she didn't. Okay, they got it wrong. But he kind of went off, this one particular astrologer, like nonstop harassing astrologers, like, oh, you got it wrong. But then he predicted that Trump would win in 2020. Trump didn't. He also said most recently that Trump would claim or come back to the throne or come back to the presidency in August of 2023, which is improbable. if not impossible. But, you know, people are still listening to this person. So it becomes this interesting question, especially, you know, being an old skeptic of astrology, and now I'm more a skeptic
Yeah.
of astrologers, including myself, right?
Mhm.
It's kind of like, what are we doing? What have we become to the public, right? You know, because, and then Gabe has heard me say this, and this is actually going to go into a funny story that I do have with Gabe about skepticism. It becomes this moment where I'm glad skeptics don't know as much astrology as we would want them to, because they would have much more poignant questions to ask and much more deadly data. So that's my take. If you want to hear the funny story.
Yeah,
So,
please. I'm waiting for the story.
So about 20, maybe it was 2014. So we once had a time where there were more skeptics who engaged astrologers on Twitter. I don't think that happens as much now. And, you know, skeptics, and I would engage the skeptics, and people always thought like, well, why are you doing this, Sam? You're not going to change their minds. And I wasn't trying to change their minds. I wanted to learn the topography of how they thought. I wanted to really scale, get a sense of what are the senses of your argument? What are the scopes of your argument related to anti-astrology? And they were often flaccid. You know, they often didn't know as much. They were relying on other people's data. So I was getting frustrated, and dangerous combination for a Scorpio. I'm bored. So one time I formed a different profile, separate profile, and I tried to engage in a debate with Gabe unknowingly. He didn't know who at first he didn't know who I was. So I tried to frame a debate, you know, with Gabe and Sagittarian Mind. Sagittarian Mind actually found me out because I have a unique thing I do on Twitter where I would use a colon. It's not a slash, but I don't know, whatever that line is, and then another colon.
Okay.
And he kind of picked out, he was like, Sam? Because he didn't know anyone else who did that. And I was like, fuck. Then Gabe, you know, when I went after him, I was like, but what about blah, 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 blah. Gabe was practically like, fuck off. Right? He just like, whatever. Like, he wasn't going to engage me. So I was just like, well, damn. And I still have that as a ghost account, you know, in case I ever get locked out or whatever, but it just didn't work. So,
you tried to trick him on the internet.
I did. And Janelle remembers it. Yeah.
I was like not having it because I was like, it was all of a sudden like in the morning, and I'm like, who the fuck is this guy? Get the fuck out. I was like, whatever. And then later it's like, oh, it was me. I was like, oh, okay, that was funny. Once I knew it was you, then it was a joke. Well, it was just some schmuck trying to start.
Just some schmuck just kind of coming out of the blue. And, you know, again, having a knowledgeable discussion, because I knew I could have a knowledgeable discussion with either one of those guys.
Yeah.
You know, especially with Gabe. But, you know, because he also knows a lot or talks a lot about the history. And so does Sagittarian Mind. His real name is Jason Fleming El. So yeah, it was just really interesting. But yeah.
I'm going to pause right here and let everyone know who's listening, because we do have an audience. If anyone has any questions for Sam and Gabe, please put them in the chat box and I will address them. So just call out there if people want to engage the conversation. So, right, it's interesting that both of you have like this sort of similar feelings about maybe what you want the role of the astrologer to be, what you think it is, but like you've both been dedicated to this for what you gave 20 some years, 30 years, Sam, right? This is like decades for both of you. What keeps you like wanting to be an astrologer?
Oh, that's easy
your
for
personal
me.
roles.
I find astrology itself fascinating. Like, there's always more to learn. And I definitely have moments where it's not quite the skeptic, but the inquiring mind was like, what is that? What is this? And, you know, I've entered even a new phase in the last few years where there are deeper recesses of study. I don't know if I would call it research, especially, from the medieval era, because how we understand astrology in the sense that we generally talk about it is somewhat different than how our forebears understood, which is not to say that they understood it better, because in some ways they didn't, in some ways we don't. So I think it comes to some measure of equal balance, but there was a different level of priority, and there was a rationality. Let me give you an example. So I've become a lot more fascinated in the last few years with lunar mansions and fixed stars, which for modern astrologers from the late 20th century almost completely ignored. Like, they didn't deal with it at all. What started me on the different journey related to medieval and then becoming the Hellenistic was because I almost abandoned astrology in 2000. I was 9 years or 10 years into my study. And I was getting frustrated because, everything was tied to Jung or some other aspect of psychology. And no one was explaining, like, well, why is Mars exalted in Capricorn? Why is the Sun exalted in Aries? What is that? And it was just kind of this, that's the thing. That's just the way it is. Or why does Mars rule Aries? Because, and I had always assumed that astrologers had met and compared notes to kind of be able to say, like, well, I think Pluto rules Scorpio. Well, yeah, I think I've been looking at that too. And none of that shit happened. That's not what happened. So I became fascinated, like, well, how does this shit work? What is it? And I still have that lingering question. What am I looking at? That's my take on why I'm still an astrologer.
Gabe, I want to actually
pretty much the same.
Maybe like a pivot between you, because I want to know more sort of your role, Gabe. But I also kind of like the questions coming to mind is, each of you, do you remember when you discovered like the theme of Mundi? Was that just like a moment? Like, had you learned? Yeah, both of you.
That was. I'm trying to remember when that was probably. I think I had picked up one of these early versions of.
Okay, pause. That is the biggest bottle of water, Sam. For people who are just listening to this in the future, it's like it's bigger than me.
My head, right?
Yeah.
Is that the 64-ounce one? Because I've seen that's like a thing now. These like giant, like half-gallon water bottles.
Yeah, I got it because I go to saunas. I go to a sauna, and
I love sauna. Hot or wet?
I have a swell. Oh, hot. And I have a swell, that I've used, but swells get hot. If you have a metal one, so it's kind of like to put it to your lips, you're like to hold it. So I got this because I'm like, I want a good amount of water, and I should drink more water. So it's good to have, that there. Stella's like, that's a mini fire hydrant. Yeah, it is. There we go. I'm hydrated. I'm in the desert. But anyway, I'm getting
wait. Before we move on, I have a question for Gabe. Gabe, are you a sauna person? Yes or no?
No.
Judging. It's okay.
You got to come out. You got to come out west, Gabe, and then we'll get you in a sauna. I mean, you have saunas in New York. I don't know. What's your? Okay, this is going to sound like a tangent, but it's related. What's your temperament? What are you? You have to be phlegmatic, son, right?
Me?
Yeah.
Or no? That. My problem is I have. What is it? The dry and the wet are even, but hot is like really, really high.
You're choleric.
Yeah, choleric. Sanguine.
Sanguine. Okay, so maybe you don't benefit from the sauna as much. Okay, I have some phlegmatic, so I benefit from that.
Yeah,
that probably is a whole other conversation.
I'm one of these people. I don't know if I have like the hyper sweat syndrome or whatever it's called, but I can sweat like a son of a bitch in church. So it's like, I don't know how much a sauna is going to help make me sweat even more. I don't know.
You might fall the fuck out.
Yeah, it might. This is like.
Yo, wait, I mean, you're gonna be at Are you at Norwalk this year? No.
I'm not speaking. I'll probably just go to.
Okay, there's a sauna there.
Is there
Wait, there's a sauna at Norwalk?
Yes.
at the DoubleTree Suite?
Yeah.
How did I not know about this? I was
I
there.
don't know. No one talks about it, but yeah.
Is there
there's a sauna there.
wait, is there a sauna party that no one invited me to?
I've been to a sauna party. I don't think that happened last time, but yeah, I've been to a party. You know,
Who's
Laura was in
organizing
there.
this?
A
It
sauna
wasn't
party.
organized. It was spontaneous. It was spontaneous. There's a pool, and Janelle talked about, you know, maybe we should have a pool party or something. Like, yeah, we could have lots of different things that can happen there.
Okay.
But anyway,
okay,
we're off topic. So what was your question again?
My question, actually, this is great because before I jump in, my question was, do each of you remember when you found the Thema Mundi? But before that, I want one of you to explain the Thema Mundi for people who may have like no idea what we're talking about, which I doubt is zero, but just in case.
I discovered it at the same time, roughly as Gabe did. I mean, probably a few years later. So if he got deeper into it around 2000, 2001, I'm not sure what with Rob Zoller. Rob Zoller is who first introduced me to the Thema Mundi.
Mm-hmm.
And that was mind blowing because I'm like, oh, that makes sense. It wasn't like by affinity. So what the Thema Mundi is this idea that at the beginning of the world, which Thema Mundi means story of the world, literally, which is the story of the creation of the world, that the planets were in certain positions based on Cancer ascending first, related, and there's different theories on why Cancer is ascending. The moon being in Cancer and becoming the queen of heaven, the sun being in Leo, becoming the king of heaven. So the two royals kind of leading the way, and then flanking them based on their speed of motion from fastest to slowest are the planets. So the Thema Mundi technically is only like the bottom 7 in a sense, but then you can fan it all the way around. So Mercury flanks the sun and moon from either side of Gemini and Virgo. And then next in order is Venus as the next fastest, or being slower than Mercury. So that's going to be from Libra and then Taurus. And then flanking from there is going to be Mars from Scorpio and then Aries. And then flanking as one of the slower bodies, Jupiter from Pisces and Sagittarius on either side. And then opposing the sun and the moon is going to be Saturn from Capricorn and Aquarius.
And so essentially it's built in, it also describes aspect theory.
Yes.
Too. Yeah. I think that's important, right? Because you mentioned that, like, for you as someone who wanted to understand why things were, was that this like aha moment? Oh, someone's finally explaining this to me.
Yes. And I needed more rationales, because what happens a lot in astrology is someone says something. Because a lot of people, even I think Gabe has been accused of this, and some people have accused me of this. You're like, are you just like quoting old white men, right? I'm like, no, it's not that. It's because some of these old white men made sense and could explain why they believed or said what they said. So this was one example, shining example of like, oh, that makes sense. Whereas when you say like, well, you ask people, well, why does Uranus rule Aquarius? Well, because, I've looked at it and, consistently Uranus rules Aquarius. Did you check to see if it ruled Taurus? Well, no, because I know then you're using a metric that's not part of the original metric of rulership. It was more about applied geometry, in terms of speed, but kind of going like, well, I've tested it. Like we haven't even tested empirically. Like nobody from classical text said, like, I looked at Venus and I think that, that bitch definitely is ruling Taurus. And like that never happened. No one said it. So
thoughts, Gabe? Do you remember when you found the Thema Mundi?
Yeah, it's probably around the same time. What's interesting in Zoller's course, I forget if he mentions the Thema Mundi in his course or not, but he does sort of play around with the archetype that everyone hates now, which is not the 12 letters alphabet stuff, but the idea of starting with Aries as like the archetypal zodiac kind of thing. And it's
Okay.
like not really a thing. It's more of like a contemplative tool in that course. But the Thema Mundi, it's either there or I read it in some old version of Firmicus, probably the Ram. One of those things. And it was definitely interesting. And I don't think I understood just how profound it was until it sort of gets spelled out for me. Yeah. Hanging out with, Robert Schmidt, and how that's like, it's a chart of the world, but it's essentially the sort of it is the chart, and it's the foundation of all astrological principles.
Mm-hmm.
Although they're like, no one sits down and explains why all the principles come out of this, but they're all in there.
Yeah.
And so it's a matter of part of our recovery process of this tradition is to figure out how the Thema Mundi explains everything. But it's also a template for what a chart is for a person. Like, it's a chart of the world. The world vis-a-vis itself.
Yeah.
Whereas a natal chart is the chart of it's still the chart of the world, but now it's vis-a-vis an individual person.
Right.
So it's in that sort of, it sets the syntactic scope for what you're doing when you do astrology.
I'm going to just kind of dig in here for a moment. Something you explained to me, Gabe, and you're actually the first person who explained this to me, and maybe I'm just crawling into the wrong rocks. It's plausible. That, like, thinking about mundane astrology through the Thema Mundi, right? Like thinking about like Saturn in, for instance, Pisces is affecting a particular part of the Thema Mundi, right? So this idea that you can actually look at it for like world events.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. It's not from like an official actual text, but it's the thing that makes the most sense to me is that if you're going to if you want to know what's happening in the world, use the chart of the world, and then when they use that chart. And so, like Saturn in Pisces, Saturn's in the 9th in the Thema Mundi. So we're talking about religion. We're talking about false religion, or the rejection of religion, or religion that is very stringent. Or people who go deep in religion and become very profound and wise and devout in a very almost severe, frightening way for people. So all these sort of phenomena can happen, like the eclipses from yesterday, right? The eclipse yesterday is in Libra, so it's in the 4th. So we're talking about upheavals of land. Homeland, of foundation,
housing market.
Yeah, housing market, foundational institutions, stuff like that. Hidden things being churned up. I'm sure that hasn't happened quite yet, but I'm sure that's part of the deal.
Yeah, I mean, the 4th house is the the in things and also hidden things. So
things.
A lot of that gets overlooked.
Underworld.
But it's really right there. And that's why how I even explain to my students, if we're talking about the 4th house or the 4th place, because that historically, I'm not going to say rigidly, can signify the father. And that's because the father is, for most of the patriarchal history of astrology, was, you kind of took on a patronym. You were hooked into your society by your father. So that's where you experience rootedness. You're like, oh, what's that got to do with hidden things? Well, the interesting thing too, the 10th house by inverse would often symbolize the mother. Now, again, I don't rigidly adhere to this all the time, but I think it's mostly true, but not always true. But the 10th house representing the mother, that's visible. Whereas the father can be invisible. People may not know who the father is. Right? Which leads to that unique term bastard, which isn't comparable for something related to, like, not knowing the mother, or the mother being unwed, or the father being unwed. That's not the same. Because again, patriarchy.
Yeah. Gabe, I'm curious to know a little bit more about why, thank you for both, like, when I asked sort of the Thema Mundi, like, was that what do you actually, I'm going to go back to the question that Sam answered. Why do you continue to be an astrologer despite the fact that you said, it's seen as entertainment, right? And it's something you don't necessarily want to talk about at parties. Like, what keeps you going?
Well, to me, it's just fascinating to me personally that, not that I've gone past the idea of not believing in it. It clearly is true. I have no doubt about its validity as a form of knowledge.
Yeah.
But I'm just still fascinated in how it works, or like how things work, or how to get certain things to work. Because part of the whole restoration of holistic astrology or traditional astrologies in general is that there's not that's not really like living lineages. There's no living lineages of astrologers from way back then to now for that kind of astrology. Some of the astrology is a different story. Jyotish, the Islamic age astrology. Apparently, there's still people who do stuff from Abu Mashar and Mashallah and that didn't really interrupt. So that's like a good idea. We'll get more data from people like that, where actually involved in a living tradition, as opposed to what we've been doing now is we're just reading Latin translations of a Arabic original that were done.
Bad Latin translations.
Bad letters, yeah, and that were done like 800 years ago. So it's just fascinating. It's just a fascinating thing, and I've put so much time into it, and it's like I could just put in more. It's just so interesting. It's the secret. It's like the fascinating, weird secret thing about the universe, how interconnected it is, and how it's really obviously interconnected, but just to be continually affirmed in that, I think is good.
And it has spiritual potency. Sorry, I didn't know if you were going to go to another question.
No, that is totally part of it.
Yeah, because it brought me back to God. Because so part of my journey toward astrology, besides disproving it, I was a youth minister, pretty much from 12 to 19. Then I lost faith in the church, and then eventually lost faith in Christianity and lost faith in God, and basically became atheistic. I say atheistic because I don't know if I called myself an atheist. I just refused to talk about God because I just didn't know what I was talking about anymore. And when I discovered astrology for myself, it didn't make sense in my worldview, which was basically at that point then referencing everything in terms of race, gender, and class, more sociological factors that shape how we understand things, more postmodern in that sense. And, even with the rise of identity, what now we call identity politics. And so the more I studied astrology, the more it hit me. I was like, this is talking about something else that's ineffable, that's hard to pin down. Like you see God moving. And that has also been a significant part of my evolution and journey. And Gabe actually has been instrumental in that, even indirectly. Like, how did Gabe do that? So Gabe introduced me to Edward Butler. And Edward Butler, had some posts on Twitter. I don't know if he was saying this directly. He wasn't saying it directly to anybody. He was just saying that, basically, I'm going to paraphrase, and he said, most of y'all, astrologers and different folks are atheists, but you don't even know it. And I was like, the fuck is he talking about? And the more I read him, the more I was like, oh, I know what he's talking about. I mean, at that point, I was a Muslim. I had already made my peace with the divine. I won't say God, qua God, but and what he was really getting into was more so the sense that, well, you want to psychologize everything, right? Everything is in your minds, like your unconscious mind, your subconscious mind, right? And not acknowledging any other metaphysical force that might be beyond yourself. And I was like, it was one of those like Dave Chappelle moments where you're like, oh, snap, that's true. Which is kind of, and I have been studying with Christopher Warnick, who also is very spiritual and more into the demonic realms and dealing with the principalities and all you other forces. And I was like, yo, I think I sort of had become like an atheist again in some ways. Like I wasn't acknowledging the mystical hand. And so when astrologers would talk about, well, this is the archetype, it was like, and if you read Plato, Plato had a whole different vision of archetypes that's very different from the Jungian. And again, Jung was trying to be the mystic by straddling still, the scientific, in terms of like, because I also study neurology, and neuroscientists are kind of like, when we say like, oh, well, the unconscious, or even going toward Freud, the id, ego, superego, none of that shit exists in your brain, right? It's not real. So what are we talking about when we say the unconscious or all these things? So that's the other kind of thing, that's to watch God move and signify through astrology is fascinating. And when I say God, I don't want anyone to think like I think like some old man in the heavens or whatever. I think it's the mysterious, and that's often what I do call God, the mysterious. But I'm not saying like being a good Muslim is saying Allah.
Gabe, you must have thoughts about that.
About what? About
Sam
we were talking? No. We're doing the I don't know, the idea of like that astrologers are secretly atheists. I think that does hold up a lot. I think people. Well, I don't know if they have even thought through the matter that far. I think it's more. There's like it's a very easy way. Thinking in terms of psychology, in the shallow way that people do in a popular manner, is easily the venue of narcissistic sort of projections and all that. So it's more that than I think them being true atheists. At the same time, people have a very materialistic view of existence and reality, that everything works in a sort of physically mechanical way. And even the spiritual things still operate as if they were operating in a mechanistic physical universe. And so it's like a projection of that sort of concept of operation that goes beyond into every realm. We can make the argument. I like to make the argument that fundamentalist religious belief that we have in the modern day is like an application of this, like applying a sort of mechanistic model to how God or whoever acts. It's in the book. The book says this thing is true, and it's like completely robotic. And people approach religion this way. People approach everything this way.
Yeah.
Their personal relationships. Of course, they're going to apply it to astrology.
And that wasn't historically true.
No.
I mean, that's kind of the thing, especially when you study Hellenistic thought.
Yeah.
And it's varied. There's no one Hellenistic, tributary of thought. There's multiple.
No.
Right?
Yeah. That's part of the characteristic of that period, is that they were all over the place. There were all these different ideas in competition and in collaboration and whatnot. But underlying all of it, except for even then, there were some people who were like, sort of atheistic, but for the most part, everyone's very religious. Everyone really, the idea that the gods were real, uncontrovertible for the most part. So that was their sort of baseline. They would go for that baseline. And so obviously all this astrology stuff is happening in this God-filled world. And now we have people, modern people, who have gotten rid of God or any sort of spirituality or divinity or any sort of reason for existence, or even like a reason to be a good person, or the idea of even being a good person. All these things have been sort of like annihilated by the democratization of all values, as Nietzsche, predicted. So everything sort of gets ground up, and so you have people getting involved with all these like powerful spiritual modalities like astrology or magic or what have you. And one, they're totally unprepared to stick their hand in in the light socket here. So they're gonna you could see people just get blown away, or they get washed out, or they like recycle, and then they end up becoming some sort of fundamentalist or whatever.
And they don't know that they're getting blown out. That's the shame.
They don't take it seriously. but it doesn't matter because it's a serious thing, and it's gonna. Their actions have consequences. This is the thing that is the most true thing in the world, right? Actions have consequences.
So like coming back full circle, right? Maybe we talked about people who maybe think now we're sort of bringing magic into the mix, but take this as like entertainment, if I'm hearing correct, right? But then, like you're like fucking with this thing and you don't know what it is. And it's, it's like people who like play with magic, so they think it's just like cute and then have repercussions. I'm like, am I hearing this right?
Yeah. It's like the kids playing with a Ouija board and then something shows up.
And if they don't see it as entertainment, then it's just more of like a narcissistic reflection where it's like, I'm learning about myself. It's just about me. And it's like, which, I mean, has its bounties, right? I think astrology definitely can be more of a tool or a good tool to learn more about oneself. Absolutely. But if it becomes completely self-referential, then the hazard is that you miss like what you're really encountering, the quote unquote larger self. Yeah. And that self exists on multiple dimensions, multiple ways. And we kind of, go around it and say like, well, I believe in a universe, which is, sometimes I think that's a cop-out. Sometimes, and that's the operative word here. I don't think it's always a cop-out. But when people say, well, I believe in a universe, what universe? Because if you think about it from a classical mindset, the universe is a very complex array of things. There are things in the quote unquote universe that are supporting you, like your daemon, like your genius, right? There's other things that want to kill you, like take you out completely, that despise you, right? And so this is, I think, even like more the primordial soup from which God emerges, where we start thinking about benefic forces, benefic aspects that are beyond our consciousness that support our lives. And that actually was something that was very much part of astrology's history, whether you're talking about from Mesopotamia into Greek thought, and then, all the way through Islamic medieval thought, was never separated from the divine. And not just the divine, as Gabe is talking about, the implications of encountering divinity related to your being in terms of becoming more of a good person. This is still true in Jyotish, but it's the added thing that we talk about. In Jyotish, he's talk about it with a lot more complexity, your karma. But, modern thought has kind of subsumed and consumed a broad notion of karma without really studying its implications and its variety. Like, there are multiple forms of karma, and any Jyotishi knows this, and they kind of can talk about the karma that becomes fixed, the karma that becomes malleable, all these things. But this is not something that is part of the Western parlance. And then we started adding things. So, for instance, shall I let Gabe reply? The idea of the North Node and the South Node, the North Node related to your Dharma and the South Node related to your karma, that's only 55 or something years old. Like, nobody in the Western canon and tradition ever talked about the nodes that way. And even with Jyotish, like if you went to a Jyotishi and like, well, tell me about my North Node and my South Node related to karma, they'd be like, what are you talking about? Your whole chart is a statement related to your karma.
Yeah.
So they didn't isolate these things that way.
Gabe?
Yeah, I mean, North Node, South Node, yeah. In the tradition, in the very beginning of tradition, it's like extremely sparse, and probably for my speculation would be, they didn't really speak openly about things that had like spiritual import. Like the astrological texts are very, this is there, and the other thing you're gonna get eaten by dogs, some stuff like that. Which actually is, I think that's in Firmicus. There's a thing in Firmicus about being torn apart by wild dogs. I forget what it is. But they were very much about the manifestation of the sort of observable manifestation of these astrological combinations. Because one, they're observational. This is a part of astrology you can just see, and you're going to see no matter what, kind of, in some way. All the spiritual stuff, now we're in a different level. We're dealing with things that are not according to the thinking of that part of the world, and the sort of Hellenic and other thought conceptualizations of perception. The sensible world, the world of the senses, is this obvious stuff. The world of the mind is not a sensible thing. Thought, imagination. That's like a wholly different sphere of reality. Now, obviously, this is not not everyone agrees with this all over the world. Like in India, basically, the mind is yet another sense.
Yeah,
it's just another sense, or like your brain or whatever. Your mind is like yet another sense organ that's apprehending thoughts as a stimuli, like your eyes perceive light and etc. It's like just the same thing. But there's this distinction certainly in Platonism and it's probably in like the other schools that they sort of like chop off the sensible and the insensible world.
Yep.
So,
and that's built into the astrology.
And it's built into the astrology, but it's also part of the problem with the insensible world is it's hard to like talk about because it's not the world that words belong to. Words, in a sense, are of a lower tier of reality.
So, just to illustrate that, what Gabe is talking about, so there's two kinds of motion in how we understand a chart. There's primary motion, which is the actual movement of the sun, which is clockwise. This is where we get clockwise motion, which is going from east to west. And that is the movement of the sun going clockwise, through the 12th house, 11th house, 10th house, 9th, and so forth. And then there's secondary motion, which is the movement that we associate with the zodiac, which is going counterclockwise, Aries, Taurus, through the first house, second house, and whatever. So the conception of what he's talking about as rational or the sensitive appetite, the movement of primary motion was said to be more about the sensitive appetite, like going through the sense world, which if you move from the first house, that goes immediately into the 12th house, which is the house of pain, right? Yeah. And house of suffering. This is like even classical thought. And then if you move more so in terms of rational thought, and thinking through rather than just being reactive, which is really the point of astrology, it's going toward the second house, right? And so this is from Uranus. This is also from, you could look this up. I mean, I could put a link in the chat. That was the idea, even how it's built into the houses.
This idea of the sort of, as you put it, Gabe, the sensible and the unsensible mind. Am I getting that correct?
Yeah. Well, the sensible, the insensible.
Or insensible, like of the senses, and then without like beyond the senses. Am I getting this?
Yeah.
Okay. I know we're sort of running on time, and I have two last questions for each of you, kind of bring this in together. Actually, I have one question from the audience. I'm gonna ask that one last, but I want to ask this question now. People who are coming in to study astrology, maybe, right, or who are new students of astrology, from each of you, what, like when we think about not just learning the basics like planet signs, houses, when we think about like an astrological like mindset, what do you want people to know about like entering astrology, or should they know before they enter the study of astrology?
Oh, that's a great question. Gabe, you want to go first, or you want to?
I mean, it's hard. It's not easy. It's not as easy as some people make it out to be. It's going to take a long time for you to really understand it. You may get your feet wet quickly, but to really understand, it's going to take years. Because at first you have to learn the data and the facts, and this is what this is a square and all the little technical things, and then time has to progress because all this stuff has to change the way you perceive reality, and that happens faster for some people than others. But it's a process. It's not necessarily a linear process. It's going to take time. So you have to just keep messing around with it and digesting it, and eventually it'll start to distort your reality in ways you may be continually amazed by. Hopefully, if you get filled with that kind of spirit. But yeah, so I would say just go slow and take your time and don't assume you know much for a long time.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. I mean, it's more an experiential.
Mhm.
I think that's more of an experiential aspect of it. But some of the concrete things I might say: forget memes, forget everything you think you know about signs. And I always say to my students, real astrology is more about the planets, not about signs, because signology, as I call it,
Hmm.
will often lead you down cul-de-sacs. I mean, you may get some things right, but
Yeah.
they're often things that you just won't grasp because you're not looking at it. So for instance, you meet a Leo and you go like, oh, you're a Leo, you must be proud and loud and all these other things, like, but you're not acknowledging that it's a sun and Leo in the 12th house, right? That's not going to be that Leo.
Yeah.
So you kind of assign things based on a limited understanding of Leo. The other thing is track it with your own experience. I always tell my students, know your why, which means you have to reflect and digest how you're learning things, how, seeing how it comes alive, especially after you learn how to read a chart and you can see like, oh, so when Mars was square Pluto, this happened for me. Observe the placements of the moon on a semi-daily basis every 2.5 days. How does the moon in Gemini affect you? How does the moon in Taurus? And be open to your observations, which is going back to what Gabe said, because it may not be as you think it is. So I feel a lot more ready to communicate and talk and write and do a lot of things when the moon is Gemini. I wouldn't have predicted that. You're like, well, of course you would, right? Because it's in a sign of Mercury. Yeah, but moon in Virgo is also a sign of Mercury. It doesn't have the same effect. So I think it becomes important to understand what is your encounter with the gods. What is your encounter with the planets and the signs?
Something you said, Gabe, about allowing it to change your, if I'm paraphrasing right, like allowing astrology to kind of change you.
Yeah.
Do you agree with that, Sam? It's like this is sort of
Absolutely.
entering a whole new sort of mind suit.
Yeah. Allowing astrology to change you, it's like prayer. And which is actually the foundation of astrology. I mean, it's katarki, right? Katarki is where you would supplicate the gods to figure out the most auspicious time to begin something or understand something, which is the roots of electional astrology and horary astrology, which is probably the earliest forms of astrology, even more so than natal astrology as we understand it. And
What is
I
this
think
word? Sorry.
katarki, Katarche.
Okay.
So I think it really becomes this, broad encounter to receiving wisdom from the divine, the gods, whatever you want to call it, the cosmos. And I think we lose that, especially now we're astrologers and astrology has become so important. We're like, well, just tell me what to do. What's it going to mean? Well, what's been your encounter of it? So,
do you think that, and I swear I'm wrapping this up, something interesting. Do you get a lot of clients? I know, Gabe, because I bring things on. Do you get a lot of clients who just want like immediate results? And like, how do you think, like, they're like, tell me what's going to happen. How do you respond to that? And how do you think the sort of expectations of astrology have changed over time? And then even
excellent
more, and then even also like in your lifetime?
I mean, I guess I can shoot first. Usually Gabe to shoot first because Gabe is always kind of hanging back and being like, yo, whatever, let me see what's going on. Right? See, look at, and you guys got to know, yeah, we've hung out a lot in person. Like Gabe was one of the last people I saw before I left New York. So this is my boy here, mi hermano.
Yeah.
Yes, people have changed, but I also do something on purpose. So I don't allow for bookings within 24 hours, right? I make people wait on purpose because people, though the people you're describing who kind of want immediate results, they're the people who reach out to astrologers and like want to know within less than, after they book, like, okay, what's going to happen? I don't allow those people to come. I want you to sit with your shit, have processed it. Don't come to me in the immediate crisis, and then we can talk. Rather than, okay, you're right in it. Like, tell me what's going to happen, without any thought about a couple of things, like what was the prelude. Past is prologue, and so without thinking, like, well, then you've kind of stepped into this, not even just from this transit, but even from before. And it's not Saturn that's doing it to you. Saturn symbolizes, is the facilitator, even if you want to anthropomorphize Saturn, that's facilitating what you're experiencing. But kind of like, I just want Saturn to get out of my first house. Okay. So Saturn's fucking you up? Or is it something that you're not recognizing? Because going back to the tradition, there was always some measure of appropriation that one had to give to the planets. And so, for instance, Saturn wants discipline and a plan. If you're not willing to step into discipline and a plan, Saturn's like, oh, okay, I'm going to keep fucking you up. I mean, if you're going to assign that to Saturn, Saturn's kind of like, well, you're not getting it. So I think the appropriation, being able to acknowledge what is your participation, in it is important. I always say that fate has two arms. One of them is your own.
So good.
So you're the one punching yourself in the face. Gabe, what do you think?
And there's a classical version where it's for those who embrace fate, Zeus leads you by the hand, and for those who don't, they are dragged. So
I like that too. Yeah,
it's basically that. Honestly, I do the same thing. I basically do a very similar thing to Sam. I don't do. It takes like a couple days. I don't want to like. Part of it's I'm not a therapist, and so I'm not. There's certain kinds of counseling that is therapeutic, and then it's like I'm not here to be therapeutic. That's not my role, and it's not my, it's not my background. So they're better off going somewhere else. It's, it's like luckily I have not had those clients where I've had that sort of particular anxiety or expectation. It's who really want to understand things, are thinking about their life, and they want, or think about what they're going to do, and they want to have like a picture of what that is. They want to have like something that they can contemplate, and something they can like sort of reason out.
Right.
And that's sort of like where I try to position myself, what I try to facilitate.
That's a whole other conversation we won't have right now, but I love this idea of delaying people, because as someone who sees people in crisis all the time, I often find that people come to the astrologer wanting therapy, but that's definitely a different role. So this idea,
reading cards at a place, that's the situation you're in, is like you read cards in a public place and you get people who are on fire.
Yes. And something it just hit me now as you two were speaking is like, how do you prevent the like draw the line? And it's maybe this idea of like forcing people to like digest their shit before they come to the astrologer.
Right.
Like, no, deal with it. And then now we can talk about the reality of the situation, perhaps in a collaborative way.
Yeah. But it is different when you are reading live, and I'm not, it becomes a different energy, a different pull. But, when people have to, book a consult and all that, it becomes it changes that. So I don't have clients like that as much. They come to me on fire, and I get my fire hydrant and be like, put out your fire.
That's what you need. You need like a big cup of water. Watch it.
I mean, that's a whole side conversation that we are not about to open up right now. But the last question, and then I was like bonus question, I want to ask each of you is you've known each other. What this is someone point out like the Jupiter return of your friendship, right? Like 12 years or something, right? If we're ranging here,
it feels longer.
It could. I mean, it's probably 13 because I didn't get on. It could be 12 or 13, but not more than that because I didn't get on Twitter until really 2009, and I think I met Gabe on Twitter at least either 2011 or 2010.
Yeah,
it's been a long time. We can that's we can agree upon over the course, right? Because you two have both. It seems like you both studied with Robert Zoller, but you both have had different sort of backgrounds over this friendship, right? How has the other person influenced your understanding of astrology, right? So Gabe, like how has Sam influenced the way you see and view astrology? And Sam, how has Gabe influenced you?
Okay, Gabe, you want to go first?
I think Sam has understanding how, because my sort of initial interest in astrology was very personal and insular, you know, and I think Samuel has such a sort of communal way of looking at the world, which I don't naturally have. I understand it now, and I think it's like, okay, I understand this is the way things should be, but I'm so used to being isolated, lone wolfing, whatever thing that I do, that how it brings people together. It's about a community. It's about creating community. Community is not a thing that exists. It's a thing that you make, right?
Mm.
So I think Sam has like really made that very prominent in his practice of astrology and his practice of just being in the world in a public-facing way. That has been like the sort of really inspiring kind of thing.
Thank you, Gabe.
So
mine is pretty simple, and I've made that, speaking of public facing, often very public. I've talked about Gabe as my best kept secret for years. Like, when I say best kept secret, this is pretty much up until around 2016, where he started, or 2015, he started going to conferences. And so if I had like especially a Hellenistic or classic question, I could go to Gabe, and Gabe could explain or give me, references, and we could talk about things related to astrology with some measure of specificity, especially like, so for instance, Gabe was helpful in talking to me about classic Hellenistic solar returns, which are different than medieval or modern ideas of the solar return. So he was a resource for me till the motherfucker started going to conferences himself, and then other people discovered him. And I was like, God damn it. No, I really was. Actually, I was going to say, I used to kick Gabe in the ass often, privately, and be like, why aren't you doing astrology? Why aren't you talking more? What is wrong with you? Right?
So many things, Sam, as you know.
Right. Right. So I used to, like, what's going on here? You know more than most of these people who are out here. So wait, what? And eventually he listened. So it's been great. So, but yeah, like I said, he's a great resource. Because he reads widely, and there's some people who are knowledgeable, but they and we have a particular person in mind, which we're not going to name here, that Gabe knows who I'm talking about, who then can start wielding their knowledge as a weapon and weaponizing it, torpedoing others who may not know as much. And that's never been Gabe.
Oh, yeah. I have the dumbest questions. I ask Gabe all the time, and he responds in text. So I will not publicly give out your phone number, but if anyone does, you're in trouble, Gabe.
Right? Yo, you seriously? It's like phone Gabe.
Yeah. I've got to say, I have in a delightful position because I'm in a thread with you and our friend Crystal Lynn, and the other day, like, Crystal Lynn's like, was it reading the Picatrix and going through all this like obscure text and like asking Gabe questions, and there's like this really beautiful, like, rich conversation, and I'm just like, cool, just hanging out. If you can get Gabe on a text thread, it's like gorgeous.
That's what Twitter used to be like. But it was everybody could see it, and people could just have like really cool combos in public about everything, like all kinds of weird shit.
Yeah, and then it's become more competitive now. It's
Yeah.
like, well, I know this, or everyone is looking for some rather than some way of collaborating. So,
anyway. We're wrapping up. I'm gonna follow up publicly. There are some bonus questions, but I think I'm gonna send the bonus questions in writing. So I think Alice asked the bonus questions. Unless you guys just want to hear them.
We kind of answered her questions as we were talking. Yeah.
Good. Do you want to raise them and just
unless she wants if she wants follow up?
Do astrologers believe in gods, plural forces in the universe? I mean,
we did kind of talk about that.
Yeah, we did. I mean, there's a range. There are astrologers who are straight up atheists. I know them by name. They just don't have any conception of gods or God, right? Which always brings up a question for me, because I'm like, well, do you think it's just like a clockwork, universe, right? Like, what do you think this is? And I think it operates along, certain laws. Then there are the astrologers who tie in more, again, another vision of the mechanistic universe through like quantum physics, which I also take issue with, right? Because I'm like, do we know enough quantum? I'm not questioning their knowledge. Yeah. One could do that, but do we know enough about the quantum mechanics? I have questions. Like, and one simple question could be like, okay, so if you want to use Heisenberg's principle, and other particular aspects of quantum physics, like, how does that individually explain this difference between Pluto and, say, the moon? You're either dealing with the Newtonian universe or you're dealing with the Einsteinian universe, right? And in that sense, Newtonian physics doesn't work or apply, because then a plane overhead would have more influence on you than Pluto or, say, Quaoar or any other particular planet. So if we're talking about quantum mechanics, then it's even much more complicated. So I tend to think that it depends on the individual astrologer and their own conception of astrology's working, whether they believe in gods or not.
Yeah.
Gabe, you want to add anything to that one? Because we'll get to the karma astrology question.
Karma and astrology question. I'm kind of thinking about that, because it can go a while to answer that question right now, because we're talking about we're gonna end up talking about fate, or if we're looking at it from the exclusively sort of more
sort of. I mean, like, I think there is somewhat of a difference between the classic idea, that Hellenistic vision. I'm sorry, it's getting so dark. I didn't turn on the light. I should turn on the light before I go on more. But harmomene, which is the term for fate, the classic Hellenistic term for it. One of them. You're right.
The big one.
The big one.
The one that people don't like. Right. That's the basically you're the meat robot.
Yeah. and then if you deal with the fates themselves, which are also part of the myth or particular myth, fate idea, it's different than the concept of karma. And like I said, karma is much more complex than we understand it from the Eastern point of view. If you read like the Gita, it makes clear that some people define karma as like, well, it's just cause and effect. It's actually a little more complicated, because you actually can free yourself from cause and effect by how you deal with your mental point of view, your attachment. Like, what causes karma, as it's explained in the Gita, is your attachment to it. Yeah. If you assign it more to yourself, then it's kind of like, oh, bitch, you want to own it? Okay, here you go. This is yours. Rather than keeping it to the god, that if you assign it to Krishna, which is the whole dialogue of the Gita is between Krishna and Arjuna on why Arjuna must actually fulfill his destiny, because he doesn't want to start a war. He doesn't want to go to war against his family relations.
Yeah.
And Krishna, the whole dialogue is like, you must do this, and here's why. And so it becomes a lot more complicated. Now, if we're going to talk about astrology, because I always, people ask me about, well, what's my karma? I am not the motherfucker who talks about karma with my clients. You go to an astrologer who believes and subscribes to karma, who can do that, which could be a Vedic astrologer, could be a Western astrologer who kind of get into that. But I've learned enough about karma, especially traveling in India, not to talk about it. That's my take. But
yeah.
Gabe?
Yeah, basically. I mean, karma is, I mean, there's a simple approach of cause and effect, right? Action and consequence that I think can also apply to some of these Hellenistic and otherwise concepts, sorta. But with Haimar Mene, in particular, there's the idea that the word literally means like an invoice. Armamene literally means like an invoice or like the writ of payment due. It's like this is the life that is owed to you. This is what you're gonna get. And it's been decided for you, and somebody, the gods, the planets have decided this for you. And this is one kind of fate. And this is the thing. There are other kinds of fate that are operating simultaneously. And a lot of these also, and one's interaction with them depends on what the individual person is doing. Is the individual person a philosopher or some sort of mystical person? Because again, a philosopher really in that world is a kind of a mystic.
Okay.
It's not someone who just reads a lot of books and talks about books that they read. It's an actual path, a spiritual path. Someone on the spiritual path has, access or interacts with other sort of deeper or higher versions of fate, whereas the person who isn't aware of a higher life or a inner life basically lives in the world of Haimar Mene permanently.
Okay.
And they're basically subject to forces beyond their control, and they get to live their life as a meat puppet. And guided to and fro by the passions and all that.
Right. And the idea of learning astrology, why it was so important. I mean, there's two terms that at least two terms that were classically applied to the astrologer, the philosopher and mathematician. So by virtue of you understanding more of the cosmos, you can become more participatory related to your fate, which is what Gabe is talking about, But if not, shit's going to happen to you because you don't know shit's happening to you. That was the classic view of it. Because you're I hate to use this word, but I think it's apropos, you're ignorant. So the more that you were self-aware and aware, the more you could wrestle with your fate.
Could we say this is perhaps still true today, that one of the beauties of astrology is the fact that you get to sort of, whatever you think about fate and karma, like maybe there's a sense of being able to collaborate with your karma?
I think so. I mean, the one difference, and I think Gabe, because we've talked about this, agrees. I mean, he might say like, no, fuck off. Again. But the difference is that in the 20th century, I think we went too far with free will. Like you can do whatever.
Sure. And
that's probably not true. Whereas I think now we're getting to a middle point, in the 21st century, we can say, like, especially with the reintroduction of fate, because a lot of 20th century astrologers didn't talk about fate or believe in fate. They're like, well, you by virtue of your consciousness, it can be whatever. And I'm like, I don't know if it's whatever, but it can be different.
Yeah.
Is that true, Gabe?
Yeah. That makes sense.
Okay.
Doesn't sound crazy to me.
Yeah. Yeah, not to say that we can, I think it's Adam Ellenboss used to say, like, manifest Ferraris in the sky, but there's maybe an idea that even just knowing that something, like, man, like, these eclipses are hitting me in a weird spot, like I'm in a way more better position to respond to my circumstances than not knowing why this is happening, perhaps.
Right. I can give a very solid example, because Janelle is in the room. So Janelle, my friend Janelle, was just here in Santa Fe in New Mexico. Okay. She left on, just, earlier this week. Yeah. So long story short, I fucked up my car the bumper on my car, and so it was like falling off. It was like on a Wednesday, and I was going to take Janelle to Albuquerque, in preparation for her flight back to New York.
Okay.
And so I'm on the highway driving her, and my bumper starts to fall off because we had like jerry rigged it and kind of fixed it a little bit, I fixed it a little bit, but it was falling off. And Janelle said to me, I think we should turn back and, go to your dealer and see if we can try to fix it. In my mind, my Mars Pluto mind, I was like, no, we can, initially I was like, no, we can make it. We can keep going. And, I'll just pull along to the side of the road, get it working and see, and put it back on. But as we got back on and went off, and then it went off again, I was like, Janelle's right. Now, I could have made a different decision. I could have been like, no, per my own character. Because Heraclitus, one translation of what he said is character is destiny. And so I could have, with my own stubbornness, been like, no, fuck it. We're going to make it. Right. And I'm pretty sure, and so was she, I would have fucked up and the bumper would have fallen off and caused an accident and become even more serious. I don't know that for certain.
Yeah.
But I can conjecture. So I'm glad I listened to her. And then because I went to also 2 different mechanics, they were both like, don't get on the highway. Even if they kind of taped it up and like, but don't get on the highway. So it's where you can listen. And I also knew the astrology because she was reminding me, and I also knew, she was like, these eclipses are, she was talking about the 3rd house.
Yeah.
They're also between my 2nd and 8th house. And also Mars Pluto square. We're just coming out of that. So I'm like, am I going to be stubborn or am I going to really listen to reason? And remember, we talked a lot about reason. And I think that becomes important where you start working with the cosmos rather than fighting it.
Yeah.
So that's my take. And thanks, Janelle.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Jen. I'd love to meet Janelle one day. Thanks to everyone who's been on this. This has been wonderful.
Yeah.
As we maybe as we wrap this up, I want to know more about like what's going on for each of you. Maybe we'll start with you, Sam, because I have some big news about Gabe I want to share. But where can people find you? How can people study with you?
Okay, so I am starting another round of beginners classes called Nitty Gritty 1 on the 22nd, next Sunday. And we meet in the mornings. And so we get really into understanding astrology from the ground up in terms of its classic origins and then moving on. But it becomes a process by which the student engages astrology from their own intuition and imagination, but kind of culled from the tradition as well. So that's a 14-week class. You can find more about it at unlockastrology.com.
And I'm going to ask a question because I'm so curious. I just love the way that you think about. You're one of my favorite I'm not just saying this because you're on a Zoom with me or whatever this is. You're one of my favorite astrologers because I feel like you bring so many traditions. Your brain has like synthesized so much, Sam. Like, do you think this course would be good for people who maybe are already like astrologers but want to like dig deeper into the sort of the core? Who is this class for?
This is for beginners, ideally. And if it's going to be for people who know some astrology, I do ask them, I'm going to make this more of a point, to kind of, ease into this process, because there are going to be people who are just like really don't know anything. So this is not the class for an astro bro or an astro sis, meaning like, well, I want to show you what I know. I don't care.
Yeah.
And it's not because like I don't care in the sense that you're bringing something to the table. I know you are. It's more so to create a community of learning.
Yeah.
And I think that becomes important.
Yeah. No, it's good. Also, those people are kind of terrible at every level. Just let's be honest.
And if people haven't encountered an astro bro, just so you know, it's the kind of person, we say astro bro because they're often men, not always, but often men who kind of just like want to demonstrate what they know until they're pressed. You're like, well, Mercury's in the chariot. What do you mean by that? Well, okay, stop. Don't you okay, we all know that you listen to the astrology podcast. That's wonderful. But let's just be here.
Best definition ever.
So that's my take.
So nitty gritty one.
Yeah. That's
And
the big thing that I mean, what else do I have happening? If you're in the Santa Fe area, right, there's going to be the Balsam November 12th that I'm doing with Lindsay Turner, also known as Bad Pastor on Instagram and Twitter.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think. I'm also going to be, I'm not putting together, but I'm part of a cruise that's happening just before NORWAC. We're going to go to Alaska.
Yeah.
We're going to Alaska. And it's going to be really cool because we're going to have these healers and seers together, where we can really, receive healing and then just, really enjoy the mystical wonder of Alaska. I've always wanted to go to Alaska, so I'm really excited.
Oh man, that's amazing. I have a friend who lives in Alaska, an astrologer, who's just always like sending me these amazing photos. Okay, so nitty gritty one. The Balsam, which happens. It's a monthly event with Lindsay, Bad Pastor, who we're about to do an IG live together in the coming weeks.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, but that's a monthly event if you're in Santa Fe. So you have a whole network of astrologers, which is rad. If you
that's growing, yeah.
And then a cruise,
Yeah, I mean, I have Mars in the 11th house, so Gabe is right. I am, despite myself, someone who finds myself building community and trying to make connections, because I don't believe in competition among astrologers. I think it's the dumbest thing ever. I learned something from Jewelers Row in New York and Philadelphia, where we can congregate and be in the same place, and it benefits all of us. The rising tide, lifts all ships, rather than thinking like, well, no, I gotta do me. It could be any one of us at any particular time.
I just have to I just was on a retreat with Diana Rose Harper, who you're friends with. I'm always afraid, by the way, I'm fucking up someone's name. So if I do that, my Mercury in Pisces, someone please stop me. But she was saying the most lovely thing, and she's someone I respect and admire. And it's the same thing. It's like there's as many astrologers as there are people who need the astrology. That's
correct.
A nice reminder. Okay, so cruise, nitty gritty one, your SF Reynolds and all the places. Unlock Astrologers or website.
Unlock Astrology on Twitter, but SF Reynolds on Instagram for sure, and then also on Threads, which I've yet to post yet. So
people, if they're watching this, people know where to find you, but there will be notes. And Gabe, I'm really excited because you're going to be joining me. Look at me, I'm just announcing. Next Sunday, we're doing a private talk. So for people who are members of my Patreon, there could be other ways to get there. You're going to be having a conversation on perfections.
Yes.
So we're going to talk about. You're like, I guess
I know. I guess I am. No, we're going to talk about the basics of perfections. It's basically going to be a little sort of version of what I did at NORWAC, which I eventually have to put out for sale.
So, yes.
And
what else?
That's it. I have my website, GabrielRosasAstrology.com. So I'm available.
Say it again, slowly.
GabrielRosasAstrology.com. Yes, and so I'm available for readings. I'm going to put out that talk and hopefully more soon, if I can just get. This is like I make one, I do one thing right, and then it's everything else. It's like I need. Sam
is a Virgo.
I'm a Virgo.
You have a brand new website that Palace built for you, right?
Palace did pretty much, yeah.
Palace. I always mess up Palace's last name. Augustine. Palace Augustine designed your website. It is beautiful. Have you been to the website, Sam?
I'm going right now.
Good. Giving Gabe a very long outro here. But Gabe, everyone has a beautiful new website and is going to be having a conversation on Talk through my Patreon next week. I will be sending links out to everyone. If you're interested, sign up for my Patreon at the middle tier, or we'll be sending information about how you can join that conversation. I'll just put it there. But that's going to be a nice teaser for the larger lecture that you are about to release to the public. So everyone sort of hang tight. Gabe is about to release big things.
Big things.
Big things. Did I get that right?
Huge things. Tremendous.
Huge,
Things you
huge,
haven't even heard about.
Huge things. Huge.
Everybody's talking about these things.
Mhm.
There are no parents, no other adults, no one to interfere with the fun.
It's great, Gabe. Keep going.
I will.
And join us for who put in the chat? Who's someone oh, Janelle says that there's going to be pool party, sauna party, and karaoke at Norwalk. So
Good.
someone make plans for that.
Yeah, I mean, really, we should. I mean, one of the problems with conferences that they get so packed related to like their academic style, that we lose some measure of the sociability. You know, I think people should go to as many talks as they can, but at the same time, it's also good. Like, I don't know how people were in college or high school. I skipped classes, and I think, you know, sometimes it does pay to skip in order just to hang out and meet people and connect. So having something more structured, like a pool party, sauna party, or karaoke, is a way in which you can have fun and really get to know each other, because community is so important in your learning journey. This is what we actually really have been talking about on some level, because Gabe and I have been friends, you know, 12 or 13 years, and we've had each other. You know, I've appeared on Chris Brennan's show a number of times because we're also friends, right? And I think having community, having this sense of connection is really important, and to form that. That's one of the best gifts related to this community.
And I personally have to thank Gabe for being my friend and introducing me to so many amazing people. Because I feel like any sense of community I have, you know, largely hinges upon Gabe, giving you lots of pressure there, Gabe. You let me in your Valens, God bless Valens book club that I half the time have no idea what's happening because we're talking about making clocks beyond me.
Yeah, you have a Valens club, Gabe?
We have a little. It's a really small. It's really more crystallines than mine, but it's like basically we get together every so often, like every month. We talk.
I leave New Jersey, New York. I don't even know what the hell is going on in your life.
You're welcome. I'm
just giving him. I'm doing.
Larry was there. You missed it. Larry came to the book club.
Okay.
And even Larry, God bless, was like, "This shit's hard. I don't even know what's happening. Why are you two? Why?" He's like, "Why are you even reading?" Larry's like, "Why are you even reading this passage? Like, no one needs to make a clock."
I think it'd be fascinating to make a clock. I'm reading about calendars. I mean, like, it was a lost art for a long time. Like, I mean, and that's pretty important related to astrology, right? Knowing what time something is.
Yes. Yeah. Confusing. But what is, I'm sorry. I'm like, I was kind of halfway in the book club. What is this section we're reading, Gabe? Do us justice here now that we're on the topic.
It's the part where you have to like figure out the ascendant for a chart you don't have an ascendant for. So there's all this stuff that he has you do that is very not obvious why you're doing any of this.
What translation are you using?
Right now we were looking at the
Riley.
Yeah, the one that Chris Brennan put out, the Riley.
Okay, the Riley one. Okay.
Yeah, but I mean, the thing is, I don't have time to go and look at my critical edition, to, like, parse out every little thing. Should, but
that's what Gabe's good for.
You can't do all the things, Gabe.
I know.
Okay, officially.
We are just hitting the 2-hour mark, right?
I know, right?
I know. This is great.
If you remember, Vivi will keep you here all night.
Right. I mean, we'll end up with a 7-hour podcast. That was Shade. I'm owning it.
I'm not. We're leaving. I wanted to give the proper outro. It's just sometimes in the outro you get the good conversation. So this has been lovely.
I know, right? But then it won't be an outro. It'll just be like, you know, hour 3 out of hour 4.
Oh, we got the outro. I'll do a bonus. I'm gonna edit this.
Okay.
I don't know how I'm gonna edit this, but I'll edit this.
And I want to thank everyone for coming. You know, Callie, who's also been one of my assistants and students, and Janelle, and Amber, who's been one of my students. I just want to thank folks, and Alice also, and some people I haven't met. So Mason, pleasure to meet you. Stellar Rendition. That's a great name. I don't know if that's like what that is.
I just want to.
Cool.
It sounds like space map stuff.
What?
Stellar Rendition. It sounds like Space Police. It's got that
Sounds
vibe.
Yo,
like,
it sounds like a band, actually. It could
That
be a
too.
band, right? I like that. That actually Stellar Rendition.
I
Yes.
just want to shout out Julia Morgan for helping, being in the background
Yeah,
here,
Julia.
and
Thank
putting
Julia.
these questions aside for me. And I just want to say to everyone, because every time Mason's name pops up, Mason is astrological masonry and one of my favorite absolute humans and astrologers in the entire world. He's like on a mission to make talismanic magic, I want to say, approachable and affordable, and this is one way of
Cool.
putting it, but he does really amazing work, and I'm obsessed with
Hi,
Mason,
Mason.
so
Yeah, add me
Okay.
on Instagram if you're on Instagram. Stay connected.
astrological masonry, the best. Okay, officially, Samuel F. Reynolds, astrologer, thank you for joining me. Gabe Rosas,
Thank you for having
friend,
us.
astrologer, brilliant mind. You could so much. Thank you for joining me, and I will see all of you soon. And thank you, everyone, sincerely for joining, because otherwise it would be just me awkwardly having a conversation with two friends. This felt robust.
And this was, yeah, it felt robust, and you made it very comfortable. And yeah, you would make Dick Cavett very proud. Dick Clark might be proud too.
Next time I see the two, next time we do this, we're doing it on a couch.
Okay,
I'm gonna hold you accountable at the Norwalk.
right?
The
That'd be
Norwalk.
cool.
Okay.
The Norway.
At the Norwalk. All right. Well,
Bye.
bye. I should have worn my fez too. CV gave me this nice fez that she
I
brought from
know.
Morocco. I
You're
should have brought it. I
gorgeous.
didn't think about that. Okay. And thank you,
Next time.
Randy. All right. Bye, everyone.
Like